My name is Damon Kirk, and I'm the principal horn of the Lake Washington Symphony Orchestra. This is a horn. Some people call it a French horn, but those people are mostly in the United States. In other countries of the world, most of other countries, this is just a horn. Even in France, it's not called a French horn, it's called a cor, which is French for horn. I started playing this instrument in the 7th grade. Before that, I started on trumpet. I started learning the trumpet in the 4th grade, and I played trumpet for 3 years before switching to the French horn. And that's actually a really good way to start playing the French horn, because the French horn can be very difficult to start to learn. And starting on trumpet builds the strength and everything that you need to start the French horn, and it's a good start for you. The French horn is very similar to the trumpet and the trombone and the tuba and every brass instrument in the way that we make our sound. We make our sound by buzzing our lips. There's nothing in the horn that makes a sound. If I blow into it, nothing happens. So I have to buzz into the horn. And if I want to make a high note, I buzz higher. And if I want to make a low note, I buzz lower. So what happens in the horn is the length of the horn determines which notes I can play. And that's just a matter of physics, and I won't spend time talking about it because it's a long conversation. But let's just say any length of tubing determines which notes you can play on that length of tubing. So if I don't push any buttons down, I can play these notes. If I add tubing, if I make the tube longer, then I can play a different set of notes. And the way I make that tube longer is by adding lengths of tubing. So I do that by opening a valve that opens this length of tubing to the rest of the horn. And I open that valve by pressing down on a key. So I've turned the horn around, and hopefully you can see here the valves. And if I push down on one of my keys, you can see it turns the valve when I press down on it. And that opens up passageways to introduce this length of tubing to the rest of the horn. And I've got 3 of those, 3 valves, actually I have 4 valves, and each valve adds a bit of tubing to the horn to make it longer. So the original notes with no valves. And then if I add a little bit, and I add a little bit more, so with those combinations of keys, I can play every note in the scale. I just have to know which keys to press down for which note I want to play. A lot of people ask, why do we put our hand in the bell? And the answer to that is actually a bit of a history lesson. So these valves were invented in the middle of the 1800s, which was about the time of the American Civil War. And before that time, these valves didn't exist on horns. The horn was just open, just one tube, like a bugle, if you know what that is. And so I could only play those notes that I played for you at first. But composers wanted to use the horn in the orchestra, and they wanted a few more notes. And we found that by putting our hand in the bell and closing the bell a little bit, we could make other notes. So I'm going to turn a bit so you can see my hand. So you can see I can lower that note down a half step. It sounds a little bit different when I do that. It sounds kind of covered, but at least I get another note out of it. There was a very famous composer named George Frederick Handel, who was from Germany, and he lived in the late 1600s, early 1700s. And he used the horn a lot in his orchestra, but he was limited to those open notes. And he lived in London for a while and wrote music for the King of England. And the King of England liked to take boat trips up and down the Thames River that ran through London. But he liked to have music on his trips. And so there was a boat with an orchestra on it. And Handel wrote music for that orchestra to play, and that music was called Handel's Water Music. And this is from Handel's Water Music. And I'm going to turn so you can see when I put my hand to cover the bell to make different notes. So if I take my hand out of the bell completely, the horn sounds quite a bit different. Not quite a bit different, but a little different. It sounds a little bit more covered and mellow with the hand in the bell. And that's the sound that everyone's used to. And so we keep doing that. And they're used to it because we've been playing the horn that way for 300 years. But I also can do some other things with my hand. If my playing is a little bit sharp, meaning my pitch is too high, I can bring it down by covering it a little bit. If I'm playing flat, meaning my pitch is too low, I can open up my hand a little bit to bring up the pitch. And so from that standpoint, it's useful to have my hand in the bell. For another thing, because of the horn's shape, it makes holding the horn very easy. And then finally, some composers write music that calls for stopped horn, which means covering up the bell completely. And that makes a very interesting sound. A very brassy sound. As a horn player, one thing I do a lot is empty water from my horn. When I blow into the instrument, I'm blowing hot, humid air into the instrument. And it's a lot of tubing, and that tubing gets cold from the atmosphere. And so when the hot, humid air goes inside, it condenses on the cold brass and then forms puddles basically. And I have to get rid of that water. So I'm going to do that like this. I love playing the French horn because we get great solos in the orchestra. A solo is when you are the only one in the orchestra who is playing the melody, and everyone else in the orchestra has to play a little bit quieter so that the audience hears you playing the melody. And I love doing that. There's a famous American composer named John Williams who writes great music for the French horn. And you might recognize the things he's written. He's written all of the music for the Star Wars movies and the Harry Potter movies. And this is one of the great solos he wrote for Star Wars. Another bit he wrote for Star Wars, he gave to all of the horns in the orchestra. We all play it together. And when that happens, it's called a soli. John Williams is an American composer who's still alive today, but he got a lot of his inspiration from classical music composers who are no longer alive. Two of them in particular are my favorite composers in the whole world. One is named Gustav Mahler, who was an Austrian composer who lived in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This is one of the solos that Mahler has written for the French horn. And then here's a great soli that Mahler wrote for the horn section. We all do this together. Another interesting thing that Mahler did often was he would write in the music that he wanted the French horns to hold their bells up into the air for certain parts, and he does that on this one. So one of the challenges of playing the horn is that sometimes you get water where you don't know where it is. You can't find it. It could be anywhere. And there's a lot of slides here. So I'm going to go through emptying all of them just to make sure I get all the water out. And I have to press down the key to open the valve when I pull this out so that the air, so that I don't create a vacuum. If I don't do that, I get a pop. Hear that? But if I hold down the key, I don't get the pop. So now I'm going to empty all of these, make sure I get every last bit of water out. And these two back here. There's some water. And then the last thing I'm going to do is sometimes there's water where there isn't a slide. And so if I spin my horn around, sometimes water will come out the bell. And sometimes I spin it 3 times just to make sure all of the water comes out. And now I'm dry and ready to play. So the other composer that was a big influence on John Williams and is one of my favorites of all time is a German composer named Richard Strauss. And he lived in the late 1800s and early 1900s as well. And I suppose that's not a coincidence that my favorite composers are from that time, because that was when the valved horn became very common, right? I mentioned these valves were invented in the mid-1800s. So after that, music got a lot more interesting for the French horns. I said French horn. So this is one solo from Richard Strauss. It is from a piece called Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks. And this solo represents a man named Till Eulenspiegel who was always playing jokes on people. And so it's supposed to be kind of sneaky. And then this is a great big solo that Strauss wrote for the horn from a piece he wrote called Don Juan. So that's the French horn. I hope you have found something interesting about it. I hope I have communicated effectively about why I love playing this instrument so much. Thank you.